Let me just speak very briefly to set the table a little bit about CED's engagement in this issue. We really have been focused on the nation's fiscal problem at this point, it's frightening to think, for more than a third of a century, going all the way back to when that ratio of the nation's debt to its GDP, like the size of your mortgage relative to the amount of your income, when that curve started to go up, which is the wrong direction. But if we've been after it for 33 years, have we been crying wolf? And is there really a problem? I'd like to try to tell you why I think there is, even though we haven't had that big bang. And there are really two ways in which I want to address that question. Number one, why no bang? The United States is exceptional. We are the world's leading economy. We print the world's reserve currency. Our securities are held as reserves by virtually every financial institution around the world and also by many, many governments. Never in the history of instantaneous digital financial trading and transmission of information instantaneously has the world's leading economic and financial power faced insolvency. Never. That history, of course, is about 15 years long. And the United States has been the only financial leader over that period of time. Yeah, we are exceptional. The rest of the world is very happy to lend us money. The risk of that is that while the United States is serving as a credit enabler for the United States, we are piling up more debt. And as you probably are aware, given that the Federal Reserve is beginning to consider the U.S. economic recovery from the financial crisis to be complete and is beginning to raise interest rates, you get the phenomenon that Michael discussed a moment ago of interest beginning to grow so fast that it is taking over the leading role in the spending side of the federal budget. So we're subjecting ourselves with that growing debt and with that growing debt service cost to enormous risk. There is the possibility of that financial bang. But as T.S. Eliot pointed out, there are two ways for the world to end, not necessarily with a bang, there's also a whimper. And if you think about the federal government's debt service costs crowding out other federal government initiatives that contribute to our economic growth and our economic strength, like infrastructure, like education, like research and development. Unfortunately, you can't spend a dollar twice. If you're spending it on debt service, you don't have the dollars to do those other constructive things. Federal government is also draining the nation's pool of savings, which means we have less private capital available for investment in private firms to contribute to economic growth and the growth of our capacity and our strength. The longer the rest of the world enables us by lending us money, the more debt we have, the more debt service cost we ultimately have to pay, and the weaker our economy is going to be. So as that whimper goes on, it will contribute to an eventual bang. Now, what distinguishes CED from many other organizations around town is that we have proposed solutions for every component of the federal budget problem on a bipartisan basis with cooperation from our trustees. In terms of health care, which, as Michael pointed out, is one of the fastest growing drains on the federal budget, we have advocated cost-responsible consumer choice among competing private health care plans to drive them to become more efficient and to deliver quality care. We have recommendations for Social Security, which is a secondary issue in this area, achieving balanced savings from fairly reducing benefits and increasing revenues so that over time we make that program financially stable, taking into account the needs of low-income citizens, including those who do physical work and therefore really face constraints in what they can do to make up for reductions in those benefits. In terms of revenues, we've talked about closing the tax loopholes, the tax expenditures that Michael talked about, and raising enough revenue that over time we can reduce tax rates and therefore make our economy operate more efficiently and with less economic distortion built into the system. We've talked about improving the budget process by restoring appropriations caps, limits on our annual appropriated spending, and also restoring a pay-as-you-go restriction. We've also talked about how to start this process, that we ought to get the two sides together, have them look at that rising debt curve and come to an agreement. What's the maximum amount of debt that we can tolerate? Where do we have to take that rising curve and cap it off and make it begin to go back down? Agree to that, and then face up to the choices you have to make to get there. Now, CED's trustees do not agree on everything. My wife and I, on Thanksgiving Day, will be married 48 years, and we don't agree on everything. So it's not that we are all marching in lockstep, but what it is that CED trustees are willing to work together. We all come in with a particular political orientation. That's inevitable. Some of us wear red jerseys, some of us wear blue jerseys. But in contrast to the way the rest of the city works, the folks in the red jerseys and the folks in the blue jerseys talk to one another. And they try to find common solutions. To get to a solution in the real world, in the big Washington, will require leadership. So I'm going to call upon CED's leadership on this issue right now. We have two of our trustees who have been our longest standing members of our Fiscal Health Subcommittee. One of them, and I'll proceed in alphabetical order, Bowman Cutter, currently engaged with the Roosevelt Institute. Bo has a career that combined private enterprise and public service. He was managing partner of Warburg Pincus. He was assistant director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Carter, and he was the deputy director of the National Economic Council under President Clinton. And on my far left, for the first time with respect to party orientation, we have Joe Kasputys. And Joe has been engaged in private activities with respect to the firm. His firm now is called Economic Ventures. He was one of the founders of Data Resources Incorporated. He was a CEO of Primark, and he was an assistant secretary of Commerce under the first President Bush. Am I right?
Also under Peter Peterson.
Also under Peter Peterson. So there we go. They are the longest standing members of our Fiscal Health Subcommittee. We actually have a couple of other members here, but because they've been standing for so long, we're going to allow them to sit for the purpose of this conversation, and so that I can speak to them a little bit more directly, I'm going to sit down right now too. So, gentlemen, thanking you for your work over a long period of time here at CED. The first thing I'd like to ask you is, when you think about this budget issue, what is it that keeps you up at night? Think about what bothers you when you think about the financial status of the federal government and our financial markets, for starters. Joe, let me start with you on that one.
All right. Thank you very much, Joe. I think what bothers me the most, having worked very closely with both Joe and Bo now for more than 10 years on the fiscal health topic, is trying to convince anybody that it's really a problem we need to do something about. I mean, I look at the charts that Michael Peterson put up, and I agree with everything he put up there. Those are the right numbers. That's where we're going. It's clearly unsustainable. It can't work. It can't happen that way. Something's going to come along to stop it. We look even in the closer future. We see the Highway Trust Fund running out of money in 4 years. We see the disability program run under the Social Security running out of money in its trust fund in 2025, Medicare in 2026. We look at Social Security, and it's got a big trust fund, right? Lots of money coming in all the time. Guess what? In the next 10 years, it pulls down its trust fund. It needs $1.4 trillion reduction in the Social Security trust fund. At the end of 2028, it still will have about, coincidentally, the same $1.4 trillion left, but it can't go from 28 to 38 without getting some help. Social Security is going to be broke in the trust fund. So here we have these really important programs, and people are going to look at them and say, they're not funded. That's going to be something that's going to bring awareness, I think, to the forefront. But the biggest problem I have is just creating awareness. I've never seen a problem where everybody agrees it's an issue. There must be something done about it, and you get them in private, and goodness knows, Joe and Bo and I have worn a lot of the shoe leather out, going from office to office up on the Hill. We've met with the heads of the budget committees, we've met with the Senate Finance Committee, we've met with the House Ways and Means Committee, we've met with the Joint Economic Committee, we've had meetings with the leadership. I had a one-on-one with Nancy Pelosi for about an hour when she was Speaker of the House, and she agreed fully that it was important to get this straight because she cares passionately about the programs that care for the disadvantaged Americans and needs them to be funded. Everybody agrees. We've spent time in the office with Larry Summers when he was Obama's advisor on this. They all agree, smart people, but nobody steps up and takes the initiative to do something about it. And what worries me is we have to wait for either the crisis you talked about, the big bang, will be when a Treasury auction fails, or the interest rates get so high they're almost unthinkable, or the death of 10,000 cuts, the 10,000 cuts being all the rest of the budget going away and interest pushing it away. So we know this is going to happen. Where's the political will? So we'll come back to that question, but thank you.
Bo, what does that prospect mean to the real economy? Everybody out there who works for a financial institution, I just want to let you know that you're not in the real economy. The real economy is manufacturing and other services. You're in the financial economy. That's okay. But, Bo, what does this mean to the real economy if we actually have that kind of a squeeze over a long period of time?
First of all, this is a slight disagreement, although I spent a lot of my business career funding the real economy, but nevertheless, any industry that depends on interest and worries about interest costs is eventually going to get hit by all of this. Let me step back, because this is not going to hit particular sectors other than the way I've just phrased it. The more and more you use leverage, the more and more you're going to get whacked when leverage reverses itself. But I think the real problem, and the real nightmare I think that's economic, is the whimper side of your whimper or bang. It looks to me as though the combination of relatively low productivity, the fact that we are going to be making it harder and harder to invest in the United States, and the fact that we're squeezing out all of the aspects of the budget that actually amount to a kind of reinvigoration of U.S. social and physical infrastructure, means that the long-run growth rate in the economy is going to be way below potential. We're experiencing a sugar high right now. Absolutely everybody who looked at the tax cut pretty much thought that this is what would happen. But anybody who thinks that our long-run rate of growth is going to be anything close to what we've seen in the last 3 quarters is going to go through a period of sad disillusionment. So that's my nightmare, is the fact that I think we're going to see a very low-performing economy for a long time, largely because of this problem. But add that to something, and add it to everything that has recently, all of the recent writings about what's happening in America politically. We are at the most partisan point in American history since 1878. That's based on work that's been done looking and tallying votes over the last 150 years. If you read that, if you read the studies of white working class towns in America, if you read the recent books by political scientists on identity in America, we're at a point where we're dominated by negative partisanship. Most of the allegiance in political parties today in the United States comes from whom you dislike, not what it is you want to do. Now, it's a chicken and an egg. Some of that comes from the fact that our economy has now not performed the way we had wanted. We thought it would for almost 50 years. Our productivity growth rate is half what it was way back. If you think the partisanship is difficult now, imagine how much worse it can be in a decade in which the economy continues to perform way below expectations. But at the same time, there's the vast amount of technological change we're seeing, which means that you'll continue to see this immense spread of inequality that's happening in the U.S. So my nightmare is what this country looks like in 10 years, unless we begin to do something about it.
Now, speaking of a chicken and an egg, we have the public, which doesn't seem to understand that there is a problem. We have elected policymakers who, if you speak to them behind closed doors, as we have, seem to recognize that there's a problem, but choose not to do anything about it. How the heck do we break that vicious cycle?
I began to believe that the only way was an education program that goes to the grassroots, because CED can get in the door of most legislators, policymakers, senior advisors in the White House and get listened to, but no action is ensuing. So the only way to think about it, I suppose, is to say we've got to educate more people about the kind of thing we saw in Michael Peterson's presentation and the kind of things that Joe just talked about in his introduction, and become aware of that and get some impetus behind a grassroots movement to say we've got to do something about it. I've kind of despair of anything that I can say as an economist, as a business person, as a trustee of CED, to move the needle anywhere. And I do wonder if we could ever get the message to young people. There is an intergenerational unfairness about this whole thing, which is enormous. I mean, think about our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. We are consuming much more than our income year after year, piling up debt upon debt, and they get to inherit that. So making people who are of a younger generation that really are not going to enjoy as much largesse as we gave to ourselves, more aware of what's going on, might start a political movement. I can remember a time when, at least I know, Joe, you and I talked about this, maybe with Bo too, when we were hopeful after President Obama created the Bowles-Simpson Commission to look at this very problem, okay? Here's a president establishing a commission to examine the problem, and they came up with a great report. You can disagree with some of the solutions. You know, there's a mix and match. There's a tremendous spectrum of ways you can get there. But they came up with a good report, the same kind of numbers we all looked at. I mean, we all know the numbers. We all know this is going to happen. And at the end of the day, the president let the report sit on the shelf. So we said to ourselves, well, maybe in the presidential election following President Obama's term, just maybe then, there would be a national debate about this issue. We'd finally take a look at it. Well, you see what we took a look at, and it was not this issue. So we still need somehow to create awareness, create a political movement, create concern, and it may only happen when people start to see pet programs getting unfunded, or people start to see Treasury auctions not doing as well. There are footsteps. From 2003 until about 2016, $2 out of every $3 the government borrowed came from foreign sources. Did not come from our pockets as U.S. citizens. It did not come from U.S. institutions. It came from foreign sources, 2 out of 3. That's falling. It's in fact, the first 8 months of this year, foreign buying has been level, and actually if you look quarter by quarter, the foreign buying is declining. And foreign is now down to only about 41% of the U.S. debt. So at some point, when they eschew the debt, don't want to buy it anymore, or want much higher interest rates, maybe it's that kind of an external impetus that we have to have. But it's a sad commentary on the way our system works if we have to wait for a disaster and then go fix something.
So maybe we should try to nail this one puppy down. Just had an experience this last week. There was an article, I believe it was in the New York Times, might have been the Washington Post. A liberal economist by the name of Dean Baker, he's not here so I can call him out, said, you know, we've had these fits of concern about the budget deficit, but the problem always goes away. So there's nothing to worry about. Come on, folks, let's party. Of course, we can turn the pages back, and we have a conservative economist, Dick Cheney, who was quoted as saying the one thing that Ronald Reagan taught us is that deficits don't matter. Is this problem just going to go away? Are we going to grow out of it? Is that possible?
Well, if you just look at, I'll come also back a little bit to a couple of the points that Joe was making, but if you just look at the numbers, there's no conceivable way that we're going to grow our way out of it unless you think that we can have 10% real growth over the next decade. An extra percent of real growth nets us about 36, 37 billion more in taxes. If you sum that over a decade and you allow for a little growth, you get about $400 billion. So you'd have to have an awful lot of extra 1% of real growth to even make up for what we're going to see over the next decade, much less get us to anything like a 68%. If I can come back to Joe's point, there has to be a way, and maybe we just haven't been imaginative enough to work across the lines. I was struck by the point that Michael made about the 4 think tanks that were asked to do something. Not struck by huge optimism by the story. If you'll note, there was a quite conservative one, there was a somewhat libertarian one, there was a very liberal one, and there was a very labor-oriented one. And I'm willing to bet that the overlap between the proposals was precious little. which is to say that what we saw in terms of what the think tanks did was very much like the experience I used to have testifying. I used to have to testify, as a matter of fact, I testified 153 times a long time ago in front of appropriations committees. And invariably you got the two following comments from every single member of Congress who would start questioning me. Comment one was to assure me that there was nobody on earth who stood more forthright than he or she did in favor of lower deficits and getting control of this budget. And comment two was, what the hell did we think we were doing cutting the XYZ program in their district? And by the time you summed it up, you had the whole budget. We have to figure out a way to work across the lines. And I wonder whether we should assemble those four think tanks, whether we should ask what's common, whether we should ask Erskine Bowles, Alan Simpson, for advice about what happened to them with respect to their task forces. You were on a parallel task force at the same time that was done by the Bipartisan Policy Council. Our problem is not that there aren't answers, and our problem is not that we, the CED and lots of other people, haven't done a whole lot of work. It is that we have not been able to assemble a coalition of people in this town who care about it. And I guess one of the things I'd like us to try to think about over the coming months is how might you do that? And I think we're going to have plenty of time, because while it would be wonderful if the next Congress focused on this and was the central issue, I don't think a single member of the new Congress, and by that I mean House and Senate, is going to Washington giving a damn about this issue.
Let me follow up on your anecdote, Bo, and I'll tell you a very similar story. I had the good fortune to work for 2 years for Congressman Lee Hamilton, former Congressman Lee Hamilton of Indiana, who was probably going to go down in history as one of the superior legislators of our time. And I went with him once to speak to a group of his constituents, and this is back in 1989, when we had a really, really bad budget problem, we thought. Nowhere near what we have today, but Congressman Hamilton's constituents were beating him about the head and shoulders and saying, why don't you guys find a way to work together and solve our budget problem? And he was struggling to try to answer the question, and finally you could just see in his face just the sense that he had come up with the answer. And he said, solving the federal budget deficit is the second highest priority of every member of Congress. And I remember it took about 5 seconds, but before long the room had erupted in laughter. And they got the punchline, which of course is, once each of those members of Congress takes care of his highest priority, the second highest priority is totally out of reach. And the phenomenon that you mentioned, I think, can be generalized into a world in which you have, in the Congress, 535 plans to reduce the budget deficit, all of which are totally inconsistent and incompatible. And the problem is that 535 plans is too many. We need one that can get majority support, and that's someplace we have not been yet. Let me give the audience a chance to ask any questions of our two subcommittee trustees here on the budget problem. I'd appreciate your input and like to hear what you have to say. Tom over here.
So Tom McInerney, also a trustee. My experience, and I'd be interested in the three of yours, is and I meet with a lot of senators and congresspeople too, and they acknowledge it's a problem. But most of them say, however, and it depends on which side of the aisle they're on, You're asking me to significantly potentially raise revenues, raise taxes, which I don't want to do, or you're going to means test or raise retirement age, which another group doesn't want to do. So my experience is they get it's a problem. It's not that it's a second order a problem. It's just that the solutions are bad politically for me, whichever side of the solution, and I'm not going to do it because I want to keep my job.
But you just made it a second order problem.
But that's what they're telling me.
No, but I'm saying that in the saying of that, they're saying it's a second order problem. We've all had that experience. I chaired the tax reform effort by CED 10, 12 years ago, maybe longer than that. And we came to the conclusion that they had to have more revenue. We also came to the conclusion that the income tax just doesn't work anymore. And we proposed a small value-added tax. That was not greeted enthusiastically by others. Any side, Larry Summers is famous for saying that the value-added tax is hated by Republicans because it raises so much revenue, but Republicans love it because it's inequitable, and Democrats hate it because love it because it raises so much revenue, and hate it because it's inequitable. Everybody has reasons. It has been frustrating over the last 15 years. No matter what you propose, there's someone who shows that it's their political death knell. And we really are at a point now. If you're looking at debt to GDP of 78% now, going to well over 100 in 10 years. 10 years isn't very long, very far away from now. We really are at a point now where the solutions are big numerically. They're not small. They're not as easy as they were back when I was overseeing the budget or back when Joe in '89 was working on it.
Let me interject a point about some of the projections you made. A lot of the projections that Michael Peterson showed us and that Bo has just cited are made by the CBO on a current policy basis, assuming no policy change, this is what's going to happen. But you know what happens time and time and time again to those projections is the Congress blows right through them because it's too tempting to spend more money to solve specific problems. It's sometimes too tempting not to give a tax cut. And also the projections that the CBO uses are all straight line and don't have a business cycle in them. And there will surely at some point be a recession again. And I wonder where we're going to get the money to fight it. I mean, one of the reasons to be concerned about this is the risk posture that the U.S. government has. We really don't have the money to come in like we did in 2008 and 2009 to spread money around, keep the financial markets working, bail out the banks, and do all the things that were done at that time. And if we get into another recession, one thing for sure is going to happen. Revenues are going to fall. A lot of programs will be triggered that deal with the people who are adversely affected by that economic disaster, and the government's deficit is going to soar right there. And how do we finance that? So you really begin to worry about the risk posture that we have. We're like the family that has maxed out their credit cards, has taken a second mortgage, has taken every penny out of their equity. They're living well, but one little thing goes wrong, and where do they turn? And we only have the ability to turn to foreign lenders when we get in that position. So the issue for me is that we know what to do, and it's much better to start doing it now. Because if we wait 5 years or 8 years or 10 years and then try to solve the problem, it's going to be much, much more painful. There's going to be more dislocation than if we start working on it right now.
Yeah, Joe, you mentioned the contingencies of wars. Thank God we know that we will not have any hurricanes or forest fires that would, possibly. And Tom, I have to tell you, a friend of ours by the name of Bob Bixby from the Concord Coalition is in the room somewhere. I can't see him because of the lights, but he'll remember this. Bob and I were speaking to a group of students at the University of Denver, I believe it was. And one of the students, after our presentations and explaining the physics of this problem, one of the students got up and said, "You guys are talking about raising taxes and cutting spending. I'd like you to think outside the box." And sometimes you're not getting through to kids, but that was one of those experiences. Do we have another question? Yeah, Tony Harrington here.
Tony Harrington from Albright Stonebridge. I'm struck by three things. One, Joe, your comment that you've concluded that public education is crucial to addressing the problem. The slides that Michael Peterson showed that the public, by large percentages in all three categories, is very concerned about the issue. And Tom's and your observations that been burning up a lot of shoe leather, talking to members of Congress. So it does strike me that public education needs to be attempted on a serious scale, and there needs to be some serious thinking about how to accomplish it. If people don't see this, hear it, understand it, and so forth, then you're not going to get the public educated and calling for the members of Congress to do their job. So, and how do things get communicated these days? Well, not too well with cable networks and so forth, but this message needs to come across by cable television and by social media, including reaching younger audiences. And it seems to me there needs to be something in the nature of a task force or initiative by CED and other potential allies from the think tanks and the Peterson Institute and so forth to educate the public.
Absolutely with you. There was another survey I remember some years ago which got down to options for dealing with the problem. There was majority support for cutting congressional salaries. Doesn't have an awful lot of leverage on the problem. There was plurality, but not majority support for raising the income tax maximum on the payroll tax. No other of the options that were put forward to people actually got majority support, even plurality support. Every other one would have been voted down in a referendum. So we've got a lot of public education to do, no doubt about it.
You know, we've all probably had the same experience, but that's why I was skeptical about those polling numbers because I think they fall apart precisely under the kinds of specifics that Joe just raised. I've done a lot of speaking to clubs in the South, and when you play that game with them, would you be for this? Would you be for that? You rarely get 50% on anything. So the public education is clearly needed, but we have to figure out a better way to do it. We have to figure out a way to make this point convincingly. There was a question right here.
Yeah, one more.
Notice that.
Thank you to the previous speaker. Public education is extremely important. As an anthropologist, I've learned that people don't move only by thinking, they move by feeling. The American public moves with its heart more than it does with its head in many situations. And if we look at the last 2 years, what has moved our public? One was the 2016 election, another was the Me Too movement, and another one was the Parkland shooting. Those created a form of social mobilization, and we haven't seen any other kind of social mobilization to that level. So I'm wondering if we can't think away from economics and think more in terms of social movement and think of a message that will address the hearts of people, younger people. And it's not simply information. It has to go beyond information. I don't know what this message would be, but I would suggest moving in that direction.
I think of the budget game. Who was it? Was it the Bipartisan Policy Center that did the budget game?
Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, I think, more than anybody
CRFB.
else. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be really great to take something like that to the colleges and have people look at the projections and say, what do you give up? Look at all the programs that we have in healthcare and education to help the disadvantaged, aid to disaster relief. What do we give up? And as this interest express train starts to take over the budget, as Michael's charts graphically display. So I think we need to do more of that. I've always seen the CED trustee as maybe being a catalyst in their community, in their circles, to try to get this message out too. We need to find a way to leverage the trustees' contacts and networks and the entire conference board as well. And if we could mobilize that, that would be a reasonable start, but it's not nearly enough.
Yeah, and it's probably a good measure of where we are right now. I actually use that game in a class I teach to graduate students down the road at George Mason University. This is the first year when I had a significant number of the students come back. They gave the game this year, I think, has a target of getting the debt to GDP ratio down to 70% after 10 years. And I had a significant share of the class come back and say, I can't do it, which is a measure of where we have found ourselves. We probably have time for one more question. Greg Petersmeyer here.
Yeah, Greg Petersmeyer. I just want to underscore the importance, I think, of explaining why this is important to some of these groups. I think the four think tanks, if the first agenda item, if they were to be brought together, would be to talk about what will the impact be on the people you care the most about with stagnant economic growth. What will happen to their standards of living? How will people with low incomes find jobs? How will young people find jobs and form families? So that there is some ferment created by these four groups that people really are going to be hurt and will feel hurt if this problem isn't solved, and the people that will be hurt are the people that are most important to their groups. And only after there's some agreement that there's a great deal of immorality and pain that's going to be felt by people that are important to them, then I think there might be more of an openness to think about how can we think about what to do in ways that could combine some of our ideas. Thank you.
I think we're done with that panel. Thank you so much. Join me in thanking our